Fun fact, Sakata Kentoki was originally meant to be in Fate Apocrypha over Spartacus, or at least he was supposed to appear in the online game that never actually saw the light of day. He would have appeared as the enemy berserker in the opposing faction to Fran, who was the allied berserker. Therein lies the problem. Kentoki is too much of a sweetheart to be put into a villain's role. Even as an enemy, you would have to be undoubtedly evil or give him an absolute reason to think that he has to fight you. This comes with the territory of Kentoki just being a big old teddy bear, too nice to fight against and incredibly dependable to fight alongside. As such, having Fran of all people, another naturally gentle soul who would be destined to die in conflict against Kentoki, just didn't make sense. As a result, he was cut in favor of Spartacus. However, what we do know is that his first Ascension design is the one that he would have appeared in-game. Fun fact, Vlad's NP is one of the most effective anti-army NPs in Fate. Kazikli Bay, in effect, is a 1 kilometer dead zone around Vlad. Utilizing aspects of his legend as the Great Impaler, the ground in the area effectively becomes trapped. Though slow and thus easily dodged by the average heroic spirit, spikes will suddenly jut from the ground in an attempt to impale their target. This can happen up to 20,000 times, leaving the spikes present on the battlefield until the end of the Noble Phantasm. But they have a different effect that we don't see. As the spikes are created, they begin to emit something akin to an aura around them that spreads both fear and panic to those avoiding them. As such, as the fight goes on, the battlefield becomes more and more condensed by these spikes, and the feeling of panic causes the person who has been avoiding them until now to act irrationally. This will eventually culminate in them slipping up and getting impaled themselves. In a fight against an army or a well-fortified area, this Noble Phantasm could effectively annihilate them with ease. So, this begs the question, why is it a single target in FGO? Fun fact, Asterios' Noble Phantasm corresponds directly with the area in which it is used, a concept that FGO doesn't really play with too much, but is very significant in the wider Fate universe as a fame bonus. If a servant fights in a territory that they once ruled over, for instance, they would have a greatly increased efficiency. This is why a character like Nobunaga is near invincible if she is fighting in Japan. How this applies to Asterios is in regards to how well the concept of the labyrinth is known in the area that he activates it. In regions where Greek myths are known, and by virtue where Asterios is known, the labyrinth is significantly more complicated. But if you were to theoretically use it somewhere where the myth was less known or even completely unknown, it would set itself to a minimum complexity, which isn't to say that it would be simple, but just not as difficult. This superstructure, which you would think would be a reality marble but is not, will remain standing as long as Asterios does, only fading away after he dies, he recalls it, or everyone he is pursuing in its walls has died. Fun fact, we don't really know why Caligula acted the way that he did. I have posited in the past and still believe the likely reason was because he suffered from epilepsy. Others have claimed it to be syphilis, a brain swelling, or bipolar disorder, and the list goes on. But for fun, let's now take a look at some of the things that Caligula did. Once during a gladiatorial fight with exotic animals, the emperor was not entertained and ordered a section of the crowd to be thrown in. The ensuing panic from the once spectators delighted him. We all already know that he once ordered his men to stab the ocean as he went to war with the sea god, or how he promoted his horse to be a senator. He would also chase senators in front of his chariot until they collapsed, a tradition which we should bring back. Finally, a personal attack on me. Supposedly people were forbidden from mentioning goats around him because his appearance resembled one. Fun fact, Darius might not be real. Authentic sources accounting for the life of Darius III, the last Achaemenid king of kings, only appears in Greek sources. Now, you would think that this would be because the Greeks were the victors and as such they wrote the histories, but Persian sources would have existed that at the very least mentioned him, but they don't. As such, there is an entire school of thought that exists to state that Darius was not a real person, but rather an invention by the Greeks to further glorify the accomplishments of Alexander the Great. Had Alexander been fighting constantly against a Persian emperor and triumphing time and time again, then it would look better than if he was simply slamming armies of defending Persians resisting conquest. This is not to paint the Persians in a sympathetic light or anything, given that they sure weren't merciful towards the Greeks. Fun fact, Kiyohime has some of the most unhinged skill descriptions in the entire game. In order, including names given by upgrades, we have Shapeshift Fire Dragon, Super Positive Stalking, and Flame Colored Kiss. Starting with Shapeshift Fire Dragon, Kiyohime is not a dragon. She's a snake. Snakes and dragons often do get intertwined to be the same thing in Japanese myth though, but the description describes how she will shapeshift while pursuing the object of her affection, going until her legs can no longer carry her and then crawling. Scary. Her second skill, Super Positive Stalking, is just that, stalking, except it's closer to tracking, because the skill permits her to know exactly where her target is at any given time and how to get to them. Finally, Flame Colored Kiss. This is her desire to receive a kiss from the object of her affection. In the event that it happens, she will become overpowered, or as she puts it, become Super Kiyohime. The only drawback is that in doing so, you are functionally selling your future to her as she will treat you as her groom forever. Fun fact, Eric Bloodaxe was an incredibly successful pirate. When we think of pirates, the images of Blackbeard or Francis Drake appear, but Vikings were just that. Pirates. People think of the Vikings themselves almost as if they were a separate race, but Viking was an occupation and a part of a larger culture. Eric spent about a decade of his youth successfully robbing blind the European coastlines. From the Baltics to Scotland to Russia, he successfully pillaged for years. After his years of constant pirating, he settled down with a wife named Gunhild. Gunhild was one of the most powerful women in all of Norwegian history, being incredibly influential during Eric's life, and then after he died, instating her own son on the throne of Norway and continuing her influence. This is in contrast to the concept of queenship being something relatively unused in Norway at the time, and likely helps to give her the qualities of a witch. Fun fact, Tamamo Cat's noble phantasm is actually a reference to a type of torture. One of Tamamo's supposed historical alibis was that of Daji, the ruinous consort of the Shang dynasty. One of her elaborate constructions was a place known as the Deer Pavilion, which was also dubbed the Forest of Meat and Lake of Alcohol. Daji was more than a little sadistic and devised a number of ways to torture and kill people. The one related to Dear Sweet Tammy here is a game where you enclose the Deer Pavilion so no one and nothing could get out. After this, a starved tiger would be put into the pavilion to prowl. Then you add in the people who have to avoid the tiger. As you can imagine, the tiger then attacks, mauls, and then eats the people in the forest with it as they attempt to flee. Notes on this are a bit scarce, but I imagine that once you went in, you weren't really coming out. At the end, the tiger would be satisfied, having sated its hunger, and fall asleep. In this event, rather than watching the torment happen from on high like Daji would, Tamamo Cat is the tiger and anyone around her is the prey. Fun fact, Jeanne d'Arc was historically a tanned, brown-haired tomboy, in opposition to Fate's portrayal of this blonde sisterly Jean. Real Jean was like many other French farmers, brown-haired, muscled, and tanned from working in the sun. At least that's how it was before she had her divine visions and was enlisted in the army. Something that they did get right though is that the historical Jean supposedly had magnificent breasts. However, any man who would attempt to sate himself with her image, or thought to abuse her after her capture, would find that he would go limp. In other words, God is anti-NTR. But the voices of God were not anti-violence. One of my favorite anecdotes regarding Jean is how she acquired her holy sword. While traveling, she and her troop found a church and stopped in. Jean told the priest that she was there to retrieve her sword, and the priest was baffled. Jean then found an ancient sword that had been hidden away in the church and took it for her own. There was no way that she could have known its location, as not even the priest or any others present had any idea about it. All of this is to say, where is Tomboy Jean? Fun fact, Orion is made of piss. If you watch my Behind the Servant series, you already were familiar with this, but the story goes as follows. Zeus, Hermes, and Poseidon all pay a visit to Hyreus of Tongra, who cooks for them an entire bowl. Satisfied with the meal, the gods ask Hyreus if there's anything he would like in return. To this, Hyreus responds that he wants a son. The three gods agree and ask for the skin of the bull that they just ate. The gods then take the skin, fashion it into a sack, and all three piss into it. They tie off the mouth and then bury it in the ground, telling Hyreus to open it in 10 months. He does so, and when the time comes, he takes the sack from the ground, and inside is little baby Orion. This is most likely why, when we first encounter him in Atlantis, he is quite literally pissing on us. Fun fact, Halloween Liz's noble phantasm is just the same one as regular Liz from a lore standpoint. This seems pretty obvious if you're familiar with Liz pre-animation update, as the animations were essentially the same. But now with the change, it's a little bit more difficult to tell. The ironic part is that it's implied that Liz actually has some potential as a caster, but that she is hiding her talents away. The further irony of this is that normally, if you're doing something like this, then you can whip it out as a trump card like how a noble phantasm works, but instead, because she was in a constant state of hiding these talents, she is unable to properly utilize them. As such, she falls back on her tried and true singing as a noble phantasm. Fun fact, while Tamamo's one alter ego, Daji, is fairly well known, she also has a third one. Supposedly, after running off from the fall of the Shang dynasty, Tamamo took a trip to India, where she took up the name of Lady Kaio, and became the concubine to the crown prince Banzoku. In an attempt to win her favor, the prince, much like many a man, becomes wrapped around her little finger. She has him behead 1,000 men for her before the people once again revolt and drive her away. It's after this trip that she makes her way to Japan. Funny enough, while Banzoku is most likely fictional, his tale is based on a myth about a man turned into a Raksha who devours men, much in the same way that Tamamo is a shape-shifting man-eater. Fun fact, David was originally designed to be in Fate Apocrypha. Fate Apocrypha was originally meant to be an online MMO-type game until it was scrapped in favor of being a novel series. David would have filled the spot that is currently occupied by Chiron, but was found to be a bad match for Achilles. The writers wanted someone who could contend with Achilles and thought that there was no better match than his own teacher, so they thought to move him to the Red faction instead. The idea of him being added in this way would have been seen as a favorable one, as it gave the Red faction a world-famous king to counter Vlad who held a similar title. However, they had already planned out the scenario where Adelante would oppose Jean, and so there was simply no available slots, and thus David was cut. Fun fact, Hector's beloved spear, Durandal, has changed hands a number of times throughout history. After Hector's death, the sword would pass on to none other than Penthesilea until she too would be killed by Achilles. It then kind of vanishes from history up until the reign of Charlemagne, where, depending on who you ask, it was given to the king by an angel or was found to be in the possession of Alamante, the son of a Saracen king named Agallant. In the latter tale, Alamante, wielding the sword, is defeated by Roland, who is riding a stolen horse and wielding a stick. The sword is sought after by others as well, such as Mandricardo, who perishes in his attempts to retrieve it. Roland would be its final known wielder, as when he came to realize that he would die in battle, he flung the sword into the side of a mountain where it was near impossible to retrieve it. Fun fact, Anne and Mary's noble phantasm is a reference to their last stand. In history, Anne Bonny and Mary Read were members of the crew of Calico Jack Rackham. Though the pair wore men's clothes and acted like men, their chests gave way to their gender, being described as having a certain largeness. The governor of the Bahamas ordered Rackham captured and his crew imprisoned. According to legend, on the night of the final encounter, Rackham's crew was dead drunk, and when they announced who they were to a passing ship, were unfit to defend themselves. That is, except for Anne and Mary. These two alone supposedly held off the ship's capture in a desperate last stand with the intensity of an entire crew of men. Of course, they were just two people against an entire crew, and so eventually they were overwhelmed. While Mary would go on to die in prison, Anne would vanish from history. Fun fact, Medea Lily is arguably more terrifying than her adult self. While the other Medea certainly has her moments of explicit terror, it is usually followed with a level of maturity that you would expect from an adult. Meanwhile, Medea Lily lacks this maturity, and so enacts cruelty and horrible acts with a charming smile on her face. A key example of this can be seen in her interlude when she wants to make pancakes. Innocent enough. However, she wants them to be made with a specific ingredient to enhance them. For this, she summons one of the demon god pillars and single-handedly destroys it, reducing its magical energy down to a simple paste to be used. Keep in mind, this is done by a servant who lacks proper offensive combat abilities. This isn't even getting into the fact that Lily still has the rule breaker dagger, but stabs people in a way that essentially forces them to forget pain and arguments that are occurring. On the surface, this seems okay, until you think about how much can be done with this concept. Fun fact, Nobunaga can fly. Kind of. In history, Nobunaga gained notoriety by revolutionizing Japanese warfare forever. Pre-Nobunaga, firearms were viewed as a neat addition to an arsenal, but something that was too niche to be a practical weapon when an arrow could be loaded and shot faster, and a sword was more effective at close range. Nobunaga was fascinated by the West and Western technology and adopted matchlock weapons into his arsenal as a permanent fixture. He also devised tactics around these weapons to make a seemingly unending barrage of bullets as guns were rotated out, loaded, and rotated back in so as to never stop firing. It is for this reason that Nobunaga is in the archer class. But, as a servant, Nobunaga uses her guns for more than just shooting. She can levitate them around her body and fire and reload them at will. She is also able to balance these guns in the air and fly with them in order to perform an aerial strike or devastating carpet bomb of bullets. Fun fact, Skahawk is arguably in the top 10 strongest servants in Chaldea. The historical Skahawk is akin to a footnote character in the Ulster cycle, but still one of immense power. But because of this open-endedness in her lore, the writers were able to do whatever they wanted with her. As such, they made her immensely powerful. She is unrivaled as a spearwoman, this much we know from history, but in Fate they made her capable of killing the gods. She is able to use the Master of Chaldea to summon servants, as seen by her first appearance where she summons Fergus. Additionally, she is not necessarily dead, making her a strange unit in Chaldea, and one similar to Gramps, both beings living on the border between life and death, though Skahawk herself seeks a warrior who can potentially kill her. Finally, she has her runes. Runic magic in Fate canon is something like a Swiss army knife, being capable of doing things from killing to trapping to hypnotizing to even allowing servants to get pregnant. Fun fact, Diarmid could easily have won the 4th Fuyuki Holy Grail War. Diarmid is a servant of rather normal parameters, not the strongest or fastest, but certainly a decent fighter regardless. However, he has a trump card in his kit, Gaibwe, his yellow spear. This spear needs to only hit one time, and if it does, it greatly debuffs whoever was injured by it. They can no longer heal, their noble phantasms may not work, and they will lag behind in combat until the curse is removed. Assuming that he didn't fall for Saber the way he did, and simply followed Kana's orders, all Diarmid would need to do is fight each servant on their own, land a single hit, and then retreat. After this, Lancelot or another may come around and finish the job of the debuff servant. After only Lancelot is left, Diarmid, who has an advantage against Lancelot, could land a hit and kill to finish the job, making him the victor. Fun fact, Fergus's sword, Caladbolg, is considered to be a prototype of Artoria's Excalibur. Chronologically, Fergus would have been from an age long before the Arthurian myth, and his sword was one imbued with the power of light and fey blessings. While not exactly the famous blast that we see from Excalibur, the sword can manipulate light and form it into a sharpened edge. Famously, in a fit of rage, Fergus once used this ability to cut the tops off of 3 hills. Something to keep in mind should he ever get an animation update. This ray of light appears similar to a rainbow, which is why in his NP he asks you to witness a true rainbow. A funny little side note is that Fergus is the perfect anti-Ku servant, because of a curse put on the latter. Should an Ulsterman be wielding Caladbolg and fight him, Ku is destined to be defeated. Fun fact, Artoria Alter opted to take on the guise of Santa Claus in an attempt to change her image. Early FGO was an interesting place because the game itself was trying to get its footing with fans new and old. When Christmas rolled around, they needed a servant that was well liked to take on the role of Santa, and opted for Salter to do it for a bit of gap moe between how we've seen her in the past. Apparently, this change is one that she herself brought on because she wanted to show her own thanks for receiving a new lease on life in Chaldea after all the stuff that went down in Fuyuki. So to do this, she dons a Santa hat and delivers presents to children. Funny enough, the presents are all craft essences, which she uses to bludgeon people who get in her merry way. Fun fact, Nursery is potentially the most powerful servant in Fate canon. Longtime listeners of this channel know this theory of mine already, so let's get into it. Nursery Rhyme is an unconventional servant being made up of children's dreams and literature. Within the confines of her pages is a potentially limitless number of tales to draw upon and use for her attacks. Essentially, any story that has ever been written can be recreated by her and used. Nobody is happy when Nursery pulls out the God Emperor of Dune or the Lady of Pain, but even if we limit her to the tales of Lewis Carroll, for which she is inspired, there are still a number of reality-shattering characters to draw upon. The Jabberwocky is one that we see appear in Fate Extra as well as the anime that is near indestructible. The Red King is a character from Through the Looking Glass that, if he were to ever awake, will delete reality. The Queen of Hearts could theoretically detain any servant and have them executed. The Lion and the Unicorn are potentially fearsome duo to contend with, the ability to both shrink and enlarge anything that she can trick into consuming her potions, and the list goes on. People don't like this theory because it means Gilgamesh and every other Power Scalers fan favorite gets soloed by a child. But all I have to say is take a look, it's in a book. Reading Rainbow. Fun fact, Jack the Ripper has a number of potential forms that they can be summoned as. Jack the Ripper's identity remains unknown, and I will reiterate that point before someone comments about the Polish barber, because no, the evidence did not definitively tie anyone to the murders, as it is still debated by experts, and yes, that story resurfaces like once every 3 years. The murderer remains unknown. As such, any number of potential reasonings can be applied to make a Jack the Ripper. The one that we have in FGO is the accumulated souls of unborn and abandoned children from prostitutes in Whitechapel, though it's not really explained well how we summon her like that after the events of Apocrypha. The Jack and Strange fake takes the form of a knife and is the embodiment of mystery surrounding the murders. The servant himself isn't the person, just the concept. This keeps the door open for other forms as well, such as the Wrath of the Scorned in Whitechapel at the time, the embodiments of lust and greed who may have been the sources of the murders. The list goes on. Fun fact, there was a timeline where Mordred would have been a feminine-looking man much like Astolfo. Mordred was not initially planned for Apocrypha, but was added at the insistence of Takeuchi. At the time, however, the issue of Mordred's gender hadn't really been decided. At first, they thought to make Mordred a man that appeared feminine to match Artoria to a degree. However, there was one major issue with this: Astolfo. It would feel like oversaturating the market, if you will, if there were 2 girly-appearing men on opposing sides. Thus, Mordred was made female. Funny enough, her illustrator doesn't seem to consider Mordred a saberface, commenting that the only traits that they share are the eye color, and hairstyle. Well, that and their chest size. Fun fact, Tesla married a pigeon. Pigeons during Tesla's time in the 1900s had been domesticated to act as mail carriers, and so they were viewed more so as pets and beasts of burden, rather than the vermin that they are seen as today. Tesla took in a lone pigeon at the age of 78, delaying the creation of his electrical death ray to care for it, and no, I am not joking about that. After this, he began taking in even more pigeons. One of these birds was pure white, and Tesla swore that it could shoot beams of light from its eyes and speak to him telepathically. His love for this pigeon was so great that he openly professed it to others and claimed the bird for his own. Tragically though, it was still a pigeon, and one day it flew into his room and telepathically told him that it was dying. Then a white light came from its body and the bird passed on. After this, Tesla told others that he believed that his life's work had been finished. Fun fact, Lancer Artoria Alter, hereafter Artoria, is one of the most powerful incarnations of Artoria in terms of lore.
Artoria, in this form, embodies the aspect of the Wild Hunt, having seized control of herself before ascending to godhood from the Spearwrong Meniad. This process kept her human but made her something unnatural. The Wild Hunt itself is a supernatural phenomenon in which something like a storm blows through an area and causes mass destruction. In reality, this storm is an army of the damned headed by their leader hailing their march. Any person caught outside by the Wild Hunt would be killed or forced into their ranks for eternity. In true reality, this was meant to explain horrible and thunderous storms that would appear and devastate areas, acting as a true force of nature. This aspect, if utilized well, could make someone like Artoria even stronger than a god, as the right to be a leader of the Wild Hunt included gods such as Odin among their ranks. Fun fact, Paracelsus believed in gnomes. Paracelsus in history is a bit of a weirdo. He was famously a practitioner of Hermeticism, which was the harmony of parts of your body on a macro and microscopic scale. One of the beliefs in this practice was that things that looked like certain body parts could cure them. For example, if a plant looked like a liver, it was probably good for the liver. This led to the opening of several doors in toxicology. But what he is equally famous for is his belief in the elementals. These were nature spirits who contributed to the harmony of the elements. Salamanders maintained fire, undying waters, sylphs air, and gnomes earth. Gnomes in particular are weird because of how we view them in the modern era. We see these squat little gawkies who show their asses in gardens. To Paracelsus, these beings were much more magical and could apparently move through the earth as we do through the air, meaning at any given time a gnome could pop out of the ground at you. Fun fact, there is a man inside of that armor of Charles Babbage's. It's one of those weird things with Fate that we don't really think about, but according to his servant profiles, Babbage the human is wearing this mechanized armor. Now, whether or not he is fully fused with it is a different story, and the armor itself is impossible to remove, so we will never truly know. The armor is what helps to perpetuate his noble phantasm reality marble, where he can create his dimension of steam. In the event that he were to somehow remove the armor, his reality marble would vanish, much like his dreams of a steampunk world. A fun little side note is that Babbage is really good with children. They see him like a grandfather type of sorts, and climb all over him, which he permits to happen, but also takes care to warn them of his steam vents, and even going so far as to temporarily halt his steam expulsion when playing with the kids. Fun fact, the original tale of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was scrapped and rewritten over the course of 3 days. The author of the tale, Robert Louis Stevenson, awoke one night from a dream and began feverishly writing the first draft of the tale over the course of 3 days. After this, he showed the product to his wife and son, who often offered their criticisms for his works. According to one account, Mrs. Stevenson read the story and interpreted it as an allegory, likely of homosexuality, given that Stevenson was friends with many homosexual men who would often talk to him about the suppression they felt from society. Stevenson had not intended to write an allegory, but rather a story, and so threw the manuscript in the fire. He then spent the next 3 days rewriting the story from scratch, which would eventually become the final copy. Some accuse him of accomplishing this task via the use of drugs, which is how uncreative people wrap their heads around creativity. But the agreed upon reason is that while writing, he was sick in bed, and so had nothing but time and likely some fever-induced thoughts. Fun fact, in her initial conception, Fran wouldn't have had a neck. When drawing up the original designs for Fran, 3 different designs were proposed. One had her appear necklace, with her head hanging down due to the weight of the metal fixtures on her head. This rendition of Fran would have appeared much more undead with this design. However, it was seen as too difficult to implement and so was scrapped. The second design would have changed where her voltage screws are. The image of Frankenstein in all forms of media is often punctuated with the neck nails, but the proposed change was to put them on her temples almost like a pair of horns. Again, this idea was scrapped, giving us the Fran that we know and love today. An additional fun little note with her first design is that her mace was originally going to be where she stored her heart, making it a possible weak point during her fight in the scrapped MMO. This is also very likely a reference to the fact that Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, would carry her husband's heart around in a jar. Fun fact, Arjuna's wish for the Holy Grail is to be left alone forever. Quite an unusual wish for a person such as himself, this wish is considered in-game to be a part of his hidden nature. Arjuna's final ascension art is striking in comparison to the rest of his outward character because of the twisted grimace he wears in place of his former stoicism. Arjuna's hidden nature is that of a hedonist. Someone who relishes in the bloodshed of the battlefield, is filled to the brim with hatred, and will create deadly schemes and scenarios that will lead to his benefit or satiate these various feelings. The catch with this is that if someone wisens up to this nature, he kills them. If he's caught in the act of scheming, he will kill them as well. And worst of all, if he figures out that you know this about him, he will kill you to keep the secret. In other words, if you're listening to this video and have an Arjuna. Fun fact, Karna was meant to have a line out of a Marvel movie in the Fate Apocrypha novels. According to Yuichiro Higashide, the author of Apocrypha, Karna at one point was going to destroy a jumbo jet threatening the Black Faction. However, the scene would have played out by having him atop the Garden of Babylon with Semiramis and putting his spear into the ground.
Semiramis would inquire as to what he was doing, to which Karna would respond, "Weapons are unnecessary, a true hero kills with his eyes," and then fires a beam from his eyes that destroys the jet. This was deemed to be too out of character and silly and was removed. Now, I could see this line appearing in an FGO event, but not a story like Apocrypha delivered by someone like Karna. Karna is also one of Nasu's favorite servants, so when the APOC game was scrapped, he decided to have him included into CCC instead. This was a bit of a problem for the game's artist, Wada Arco, because Karna's artist, Paco's designs, are very over the top. As such, in order to implement him into 3D, he had to have his iconic flame cape redesigned. Fun fact, Mysterious Heroine X, along with the rest of the Servantverse servants, will remain after the events of Fate Grand Order. The Servantverse as a whole is mind-melting, but to put it simply, it's an alternate universe next to our own, or sometimes just a different galaxy out in space. Point being, the residents there are not tied to the Throne of Heroes like normal servants are. A harsh reality that we will have to face is knowing that all of our summoned servants will eventually disappear back to the throne, but the Servantverse ones will remain as they have no such tie, meaning that a character like MHX for the rest of the main character's life could just stop on by and check up on them and mash. This is something to take comfort in, knowing that canonically, no matter what happens or how things go down, we always know that MHX and the rest of the Servantverse will be there. Fun fact, Theon had his wife stolen by his subordinate knight Diarmid. In his older years, Theon sought a third wife and was given Gryne, the daughter of the High King who had initially accepted the proposal until realizing how old Theon was. At their wedding feast, Diarmid catches her eye and she bewitches him with a spell to take her away. The next morning, the jealous Theon sends his men, many of them friends with Diarmid, to track him down, and they only do so under the threat of death. Diarmid is given many outs to escape by these men and his old mentor Og, but declines them all and instead flees in front of Theon by vaulting a river with his spear. Theon tried everything in his power to get back his unwilling wife, from hiring the armies of other kings to luring him out with board games to having his old nurse, who was also a witch, try and poison him, all of which failed. Naturally, by this time, any spell that may have been put on Diarmid would have worn out, so these were by now his own actions to resist. Eventually, an agreement was struck between the two, and Theon relented. Years later, however, this jealousy hadn't gone away, and when he and Diarmid were hunting a great boar, and his former knight was gouged, he twice refused to heal the dying man, and only under threat from his family went to do so, but by then it was too late. Fun fact, Brynhild is wearing a Japanese schoolgirl sailor outfit. This is because originally she and Sigurd were both meant to have Japanese school uniform type designs that would complement one another. While this appears to have mostly been scrapped by the time we got to Sigurd, the remnants of this remain with Bryn. Another weird thing about her design is her weapon, which, according to the translation of her illustrator's notes, is not a spear, but a halberd. This does make a bit more sense, given that it appears as a giant purple heart. Additionally, the weapon itself is capable of growth, but this growth is directly proportionate to the amount of love that she feels for Sigurd at that point in time. In fact, her unique trait, Brynhild's beloved, likely is her seeing aspects in other people that remind her of her husband, and while it's primarily men on that list, some women, like Ushiwakamaru, do make the list as well. Fun fact, Fate's Beowulf is based on Tyler Durden from the movie Fight Club. When I initially found this, I assumed that somebody had vandalized the page, but no, there's an actual tweet from the scenario writer, Yuichiro Higashide, that reads as follows, quote, "I was in charge of the setting for Beowulf. The concept was based on Tyler Durden. Rule number 1, don't mention the Holy Grail War. Rule number 2, don't ever mention the Holy Grail War." In hindsight, this makes sense, given that Beowulf, at least in his rendition in Fate, has a preference for using his fists to fight as opposed to his weapons. This is in stark contrast to the more kingly Beowulf that can be seen near the end of his tale. However, this may have also been inspired by how Beowulf, using only his strength, ripped the arm of the fearsome Grendel off, showing his own true physical prowess without a need for weapons. Fun fact, Nero Bride is somewhat of a halfway point between her normal saber self and her caster self. It is not really a mystery to anyone that Nero is more proficient in the caster class, with even her own bond line stating as such. Her saber form seems to be more weighed down by her migraine ability, which hampers these skills. However, in her bride form, her own joy at the prospect of being married seems to allow her to cast more potent magic than she normally could as a saber. It is for this reason that she has so many support skills. Well, that and her marriage likely being celebrated by her giving gifts to her generous patrons. Fun fact, Shiki can theoretically kill gods. While this is hardly news to K&K fans, the average FG Joe may not realize quite how powerful her mystic eyes actually are. The mystic eyes of depth perception, when utilized at their full capacity, are able to quite literally see the lines of a person or thing's lifespan. Utilizing that knowledge, she is able to sever these lines. Now, you may think that someone like, say, Herc should be able to survive this given how God Hand works, but this severance is instead applied to the individual, which allows it to bypass external effects such as immortality. What I'm trying to say is that she should have guts removal on her NP. Fun fact, Amakusa's inclusion as the main villain of Apocrypha was inspired by a 1960s fantasy novel. An issue among many when developing Fate Apocrypha was deciding on who the villain should be. While there were certainly strong contenders on both sides to be a surprise villain, none had the oomph that the writers were looking for. This is where they took inspiration from Yamada Futaro's 1964 fantasy novel, Makai Tensho. This novel is almost like a precursor to Fate, having figures like Yui Shosetsu and Amakusa Shiro as antagonists. In the novel, Mori Soiken survives the Shimabara Rebellion and uses magic to resurrect great warriors to overthrow the shogunate. Among these are Miyamoto Musashi, Hozuin, and Yagyu Munenori. However, Yagyu Mitsetoshi breaks free from this control and aims to rebel against Amakusa and his posse of resurrected fighters. In most adaptations, Amakusa is the string puller and main antagonist, replacing Morisoken. Fun fact, Astolfo is still out there living his best life. Spoilers for the end of Apocrypha, but the winner of that Holy Grail war was, somehow, Astolfo. Astolfo opted to incarnate into the world, essentially giving himself a flesh and blood body, and made it his mission to check up on the survivors of the war. To this end, he has begun keeping a travel journal to alleviate his bad memory, and meets up with Fiore after she moves to New York. He also sets off for the Middle East in hopes of discovering how Amakusa got a catalyst for someone like Semiramis. However, this means that in a timeline, Astolfo is actively still out in the world, meaning that depending on which timeline we are a part of in FGO, we could potentially meet up with him post-Grand Order. Fun fact, Kid Gil was originally going to have the armor of his adult self. The Kid Gil that we have is more or less the same one that we get in Hollow Ataraxia. However, his artist, Tenku Sphere, wanted to give his third ascension a bigger pop. To this end, he originally planned to give him a miniature version of the Golden Man's armor, but this seemed to break away from the childlike form that he had up until that point. So instead, he was given a massive cape, and the armor instead kind of floats around his body. Tenku Sphere notes that he imagines Kid Gil having to slowly drag the implements of his new ascension around as though they were super unwieldy, which is a funny image. Fun fact, Dante's is unironically designed to be a different aspect of Komaeda from Danganronpa. When he was initially illustrated, he was meant to be the pure embodiment of revenge. He was also intentionally designed to be a young man outside of what would technically be his prime, because there was a pre-existing older Dante's that was already famous in Japan, found in the Gankutsuo telling of the tale. However, it was a very clear choice to design him after the pre-existing Komaeda design with some alterations. For instance, his working title was Super High School Level Heroic Spirit, which is a reference to the characters of Danganronpa being super high-level students. Additionally, his famous line, "Wait and hope," is again reminiscent of Komaeda, who has an obsession with the concept of hope. In a sense, these two serve as two sides of the same coin, though determining which one is chunier is difficult. Fun fact, Nightingale has a list of servants that she believes are mentally ill. On this are some that you may expect, such as Gills, Phantom, Caligula, Salome, Mori, and Salieri. But she also includes some interesting people like Koji, Bob, Ushigozen, and Kriemhild. Ushigozen I wouldn't describe as crazy, but more so inhuman given that she, well, isn't a human. The same could honestly be said for Bob, who, of all the people on this list, is arguably the most normal. Koji is a weird one because she is certainly eccentric, but I don't think she would classify as mentally ill. Last is Kriemhild, who is covered head to toe in that madness enhancement, but this is an example of the pot calling the kettle black, as Nightingale is the one doing the judging. Additionally, Dante's has a special line for her where she addresses that he seems to be avoiding her treatment, and even more funnily, if you have cleared a certain part of the story, she seems to actually be preventing him from leaving. Fun fact, Ku Alter's Noble Phantasm is one of the most powerful single-target NPs in terms of lore. Kirit Konhen is the skeletal remains of the sea serpent whose bones were used to make Gaebol. Donning this as both an armor and a weapon, Ku is able to truly tap into his berserker nature. Now, where the original Gaebolg's lethality came from its barbs spreading throughout the body, Kirit Konhen works in much the same way, with one major exception. Gaebolg is a singular hit that buries the spear inside the body. This is multiple slashes with the claws that give off the same effect. Given their monstrous origins, they are even able to pierce through someone like Skahawk with relative ease, and even at one point killing all of Herc's 12 lives. Each scratch causes the same effect as a normal Gaebolg, but then amplifies that effect with each consecutive strike. It is for this reason that at the end of his NP animations, we see the spikes fly out of the body because enough were created inside the victim that the only place left to go was out. Fun fact, Maeve's design was made intentionally to have her remove her clothes. Her artist, Takayama Kisai, was given the general concept of Maeve slave, that being a princess knight in white, and so designed what we know today as her second ascension. From here, to give off the stripping impression, it was decided that she would have some form of large coat, and to go with the all-white theming that she has, made it soft and fluffy to keep her warm. Funny enough, people who are familiar with digital design can see pretty clearly that her coat is just a layer cover for her second ascension. After this, her design shifts a little bit and the artist took some liberties of their own, taking inspiration from wrestling to alter the design. Whether they were intending this to be an innuendo or not is to be seen. Fun fact, Helena at one point had a more militaristic design. This design here was tweeted by her artist Matsuryu while initially designing her. However, as we all know, this didn't come to fruition. Supposedly, after a conversation with Takeuchi, the design was changed to the one that we now know today. Now, why did this happen? Well, I can't give you a straight answer on that as we don't know, but I can posit a theory. For one, this design doesn't necessarily scream caster. Additionally, Helena herself, though at one point claiming to have been a soldier, was not known to have fought on the side of her homeland Russia. Finally, the design evokes a certain feeling of a type of soldier that was globally hated, albeit after her time, and would likely bring an unwanted sort of attention to the game. An additional little fun fact is that Helena's favorite meal was a boiled egg floating in a pool of butter. Fun fact, we may see Rama and Sita reunited at some point in FGO's future. It's a long story to explain why Rama can never see Sita again, even after manifesting as servants, but know that he was cursed by the monkey that curses you if you kill its partner. As a result of this, whenever Rama is summoned, Sita is technically also summoned, existing as a part of the same saint graph, though remaining dormant. This works in reverse as well, where if Sita is summoned, Rama becomes the dormant side. Up until recently, this was made manifest in Rama's skill, Curse of Separation. However, this skill has received an upgrade to change not just the effect, but also the name. Now it is referred to as Dream of Reunion. While this in no way has removed the curse, it shows that the desire to meet one another has grown even further. This means that this renaming has the potential to serve as a setup for Sita to one day manifest in Chaldea outside of the arcade cabinet. Fun fact, Li Xuan once beat a Russian boxer much larger than himself. Sources in English on Li Xuan's life are slim, so take this with a grain of salt. At one point, a Russian boxing champion by the name of Molotov came to Beijing to challenge various martial artists. This man would not only defeat them with his massive size advantage and strength, but also insult the losers in the process. Word of this got to Li, who was attending to his sick mentor, and agreed to fight the man. In the ring, the boxer supposedly made fun of Li's tiny stature, placed both of his hands on his shoulders, and spat on him. In response, Li broke his ribs, ripped an egg-sized chunk from the man's cheek, and hit him hard enough to send him reeling out of the ring. For this victory over Molotov, he was rewarded with a golden Buddha. Fun fact, Geronimo is one of the more powerful casters in Chaldea. Despite how he actually plays in-game, in terms of lore, Geronimo's shamanistic abilities are ranked high enough to put the fear of God into even somebody like Doman. Fate's magical power scaling system seems to favor magical abilities that are closer to their primordial origins. It's for this reason that runic magic, for example, is so potent. Shamanism works in much the same way, drawing directly from the primordial, opening dialogue with the spirits of nature to utilize their power. Utilizing this, Geronimo is able to call upon incredibly powerful beings to aid him, such as the spirit of the wolf and the spirit of the coyote. I bring up Doman in particular because there is actual in-game dialogue of Doman expressing fear of Geronimo. This isn't the same as someone like Sei, who he is also afraid of, because Sei seems to have developed techniques specifically to deal with Doman. Meanwhile, the sheer presence of the G-Man causes the Ridicule Cat to shudder. Fun fact, Billy barely has a noble phantasm. The Thunderer is both the name of Billy's NP as well as the gun that he used, the 41 Colt Thunderer. What the actual effect of his noble phantasm is the ability to counterattack an enemy who is attacking him by being able to draw his weapon and fire it at a speed that makes it so that he will hit first. The funny thing about this is that Billy can just do that. This noble phantasm, due to its near lack of magical energy use, is more akin to a personal skill. Billy, in life, was famed for his quick draw abilities, and this talent has been translated over to his servant form, which also gives him heightened awareness of his surroundings. As such, he can more easily hone in on where an enemy may be, predict when they will attack, and then respond with 3 bolts between the eyes before they ever get a chance to act.